IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleague Aditya Pareek, and we're going to be talking about a really interesting set of developments that took place about a week ago. Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing to attend the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics. There he had a significant meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and the two sides came out with a lengthy joint statement which has some really, really interesting bits in there. And for many analysts around the world, sort of heralds a new regime in that relationship, but not just that relationship, but also the direction of the world order. So to talk about all of this, Aditya and I are going to be looking at the joint statement and obviously talk about our own approaches to understand China and Russia and what's happening in that bilateral relationship and what are the implications for India. Pareek, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Manoj. Great to be here.
So let's begin by just getting your sense of the joint statement. What did you make of it?
So there were a few key points like the concern over the newly formed AUKUS alliance rather than the Quad. So that was very interesting to me because it pretty much means that they're discounting Japan and India out of the, concern conversation about their adversaries. So just like people speculate, analysts speculate that, Quad wasn't pretty much up to it, the same way the adversaries of that alliance, so to say, are also confirming the same thing. And there were things about the bilateral relationship between Russia and China. So there, in the past, I've noticed a few fissures and wedges in that relationship. For example, the fisheries trade war, undeclared fisheries trade war that happened because of China's overtly concerns about COVID's transmission through the fish they were importing from the Russian Far East. So once they put a hold on that, those restrictions led to a lot of losses to the Russian Far East because their economy is basically tourism and mineral extraction, hydrocarbon extraction. So that was a huge chunk, like 30% of the revenue or so was lost because of that. And this wedge healed in about 1.5 years and apparently took the highest level of intervention. So President Putin and Xi Jinping met and they apparently intervened in the situation. Only then the joint statement now reflects that the customs regimes would be more closely cooperated on and these situations would be avoided. There's also stuff about which doesn't get talked about, isn't part of the joint statement, but I think it's better to mention it that there are fissures that even though they talk this alliance up quite a bit, it's very pragmatic. So there's stuff about high-tech military industrial espionage. So very recently, Vladivostok-based businessman was detained on charges of treason, and he used to work in China, working on high-tech industries, and it's believed that it's related to submarines. And earlier in 2021, there was a hack on the Rubin Design Bureau of Russia. So they designed Russia's most advanced submarines and apparently the cyber attack originated from China. So there are definitely a few things there. And the joint statement talks up the relationship, but there's stuff that I think serves as wedges and fissures in the relationship.
So it's interesting. I mean, let me just sort of, at least, this is what I find fascinating is that there are clearly differences of opinion amongst you and me on this. So from my point of view, when I went through the joint statement, I mean, I thought that there was a very clear commonality of purpose, particularly in terms of their visions of what they want the world to be like. But I agree with you. There are, that commonality of purpose does not necessarily mean commonality of approaches and agreement and all of that because there are different interests. I mean, and this is not an alliance, firstly, in that conventional sense. It's not like NATO. And we can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because if I recall, both sides tend to make this comment about how this is not an alliance, but rather it's better than an alliance. And that sort of makes the point that, an alliance may put certain needs on you, certain demands on you. An informal alliance may also put certain expectations from each side, which, if you go back to history, were there between the Soviet Union and the PRC. And, and when you don't meet those expectations, that can lead to their own sort of fissures in the relationship. So, in that sense, they see pragmatism as having managed that element of it. Also, they see a certain, and this I will want to get your thought on later, about whether again, a pragmatic relationship which is de-ideologized, so which is not dependent on a common ideology, like say the relationship with the Soviet Union and the PRC, in the 50s, 60s was. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? But we'll get to that in a bit. On the sort of issue of the Quad, so again, I disagree with you there because I see, and I'll quote from the joint statement, right? They say the two sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon its ideological Cold War approaches, to respect the sovereignty, security, and interest of other countries, etc., etc. Then they say that the two sides stand against the formation of closed bloc structures and opposing camps in the Asia Pacific region and remain highly vigilant about the negative impact of the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy on peace and stability in the region. So they do, and I would see the Quad in this sort of context, right? And again, the Russians have been quite vocal. If I remember correctly, last year when Sergei Lavrov visited India, in India he made a point about how, that there is concern in Russia about the Indo-Pacific strategy, and they don't necessarily see it as a positive. So I don't necessarily think that they see the Quad as something which is irrelevant, but and the Quad has made it a point to also suggest that to state that it's not a military partnership for its own reasons. So on that, that's sort of where I stand. On the wedges and fissures, I mean, I agree at a sort of principle level that, yes, there are going to be these challenges in terms of how each side approaches things. And I think we can see that in Ukraine, in the issues around Ukraine, that there is not necessarily a commonality of how you would go about doing things. But on the issue of, say, the case of espionage that you talked about, I mean, it's pretty natural. And I think states expect each other, even with allies, you expect, that sort of espionage and events to take place. Look at the US and its European allies. Even under Obama, there was surveillance happening at different levels. So it's not like you don't expect some of that to happen. Obviously, it jars, and that's what happened. And there was damage control from the American side after that became public, and those can create stresses. But yeah, I mean, that's its sort of own challenge. So I want to sort of focus on some of these, when you talk about wedges and fissures, when it comes to, say, the current issue of Ukraine, do you see that as, because there are clear differences of interests in China and Russia in terms of how they see the current situation in Ukraine and NATO. But do you see their ability to come together to come to this common language about the expansion of NATO as, the relationship displaying enough resilience that they could deal with those differences to be able to arrive at a common approach?
Yeah, I think they can arrive at a common approach, but the devil would be in the details. So, when you talk about Ukraine, you can't really separate to the conversation on the EU and Europe and the gas market there. So, the main concern in Russia is as much economic as much as its security. Even if they are putting up the security treaties and draft security treaties and legally binding guarantees forward as the first concern, but I think the calculation is also economic and geoeconomic. So if I bring up the kind of agreements that went out with the joint statement, so the new deal that they signed on hydrocarbon, I think, say for example, the LNG supply agreement, when it's going to come into effect, about 65 to 85% of exports from Russia to China would be minerals and hydrocarbons, and that's a huge dependency thing that Russia is building with China. So they are thinking of this in terms of, if sanctions are imposed from the EU and they lose that market, so they're going to make up for it in another market. But it's more political because here's the catch: the problem is the gas that they're supplying to China is at a far reduced price, about 20 to 25% lower than what they sell it to many countries in EU. There's spot pricing and all that, but generally it's 20 to 25% lower. And I think the only cheaper rates are in Russia's own domestic market. So it's a very lopsided relationship as of now with Russia basically quoting China that you have to support us when it's our time of need. So I think accommodating part is only from Russia, and China just, does what's best for its interests. So even if there's a positive statement on non-expansion of NATO, I think there are very pragmatic concerns. Say, for example, on sanctions, even there's a whole can of worms to be opened on how their relationship about de-dollarizing and diluting the effect of Western sanctions would play out. But if you read the details, China has not been very supportive of Russia. So if sanctions are imposed, I think we're talking about three big things. We're talking about to de-swifting, de-platforming from fund transfer messaging services like Swift. So, China and Russia tried this before between their domestic messaging fund transfer services, SPFS, which is Russia's, and CIPS of China's. So that did not work out. It ended up as 27 Russian banks signing up for CIPS and only one Chinese bank signed up for SPFS. So it's again a very lopsided, only one side complying, acting in good faith kind of a situation. And when you talk about how they would deal with de-dollarizing, well, central bank digital currencies are the talk of the town right now, but it's mostly buzz because if they couldn't figure out cooperation on messaging services, I don't think they would very easily figure out digital currencies because it's the same paradigm dialed to the max. So I don't think that's happening. And on top of that, China's financial institutions are pretty invested in the US, as I'm sure you also hold the same view, because they are very reluctant on touching anybody on the US's specially designated list, which the US Treasury issues. So if a Russian individual, a Russian entity is on that list, they're very against making transactions with them, touching any transaction that any such individual or entity does. It's the same with Indian banks. They are loath to deal with anything that's sanctioned by the US Treasury. So China is not that accommodating, really.
Right. We'll come back to this conversation after a brief break, but this is a really fascinating point where we can take a break and we can sort of ponder about the points that you made.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, film producer Siddharth Roy Kapoor joins Cyrus to talk about his latest web series, Rocket Boys. On Shunyavan, Shiladitya and I meet Aditya Sharma. He's the co-founder at The Soul Store. We talk to him about how the popular brand came to be and what their journey has been like. On a show about crypto, Rohan talks to Rahul Sanghi, co-founder at Tiger Feathers. They explore Web 3.0 and its advantages and disadvantages. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav weaves a fascinating story that connects Gujaratis, Uganda, and the last king of Scotland. And on Hanswani, we hear the story Bhoot Ka Kalakar. It explores the conflict between art and its artists. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, please do tell a friend. It really does help us when you spread the word about our podcast. And I'd also like to ask you if you could rate or recommend wherever you listen to our podcast. And speaking of where you listen to this show, if you're on an Android phone, do check out our new Android app. We have a brand new app with a brand new listening experience. Definitely check it out. I think you will enjoy it. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
All right. Thank you for joining us for All Things Policy. We've been talking about the relationship between China and Russia in the light of the recent joint statement between the two sides after Vladimir Putin's visit to Beijing. For those who don't know, was the first time in over 2 years that Xi Jinping had been meeting a foreign leader in person. So throughout the pandemic, he's been doing all these meetings via video link. And so therefore, it was even very closely watched. And for people who were looking at the video, you could see that when Putin walks up to Xi, they smile, they nod their heads, but they don't shake hands. That was apparently protocol put forward by the Chinese side requesting no shaking of hands due to the pandemic, although there were no masks. All right, so we'll get back to the point that we went into before we took the break, which was essentially the economic engagement between the two sides and how Pareek was talking about that, talking about the nature of the relationship in which essentially there is a greater need demonstrated from the Russian side for a closer relationship, whereas the Chinese side has been much more cautious in many ways, and that's partly a product of differences of economic engagement with Western institutions and global financial institutions, and also just different approaches, different needs, different interests. And I'll just quote a little bit of information that I gathered yesterday while I was reading through the People's Daily, which had an interesting article about the economic dimension of the China-Russia relationship. And you can find this in my daily People's Daily tracker. It talks about how data from the Russian Central Bank and Customs Administration shows that the RMB currently accounts for more than 17% of Sino-Russian bilateral trade settlement and more than 12% of Russia's international reserves. So 17% of trade settlement is really not that significant, and I presume a significant amount of this is also now happening in euros because they will tell us that the Russians have started to increase the component of percentage of the euros that they hold in terms of their international reserves. Another example of this attempt at de-dollarizing has been the Gazprom CNPC deal that I presume Pareek you were referencing, that was signed this time in the visit, which talks about essentially that this trade being done settled in euros just as a measure to diversify with US dollars. And again, I agree with you there. I don't think that the Chinese, and that's fundamentally a structure of differences of the structure of the economy, of the way Chinese enterprises are deeply linked into the system, into sort of American, sort of Western financial system, and that's going to make it really difficult for them to do this. So I think that's where I sort of agree with you that there is some degree of challenge in doing this. That I think the difference between perhaps your and my view is that I don't see it as a fissure. I see it as a something that is going to be challenging, yet they are trying to move towards in that direction. Their progress and their success will be limited by multiple factors, and so it will never match the rhetorical sort of height. But I don't sort of therefore see it as a fissure. But yeah, I mean, I want to sort of put that on the table. The next thing that I want to move to is space, and you've done a lot of work in with regard to space and the geopolitics around space. I wanted to get your sense on, they talk about complementarities in their navigation systems. That is one of the sort of agreements that they've signed. What's the sort of, and there's been lots of talk, right, that they'll do a joint moon base and things like that, which is again demonstrative of the kind of political trust that exists. What's the kind of development that's taking place in terms of China-Russia space cooperation?
So the first thing you talked about, the GNSS cooperation, Global Navigation Satellite Systems. So Baidu and GLONASS augmenting each other is not really very high cost for either side. So it's kind of a norm around the world that one navigation system augments the other in areas where it has less coverage. So geographically and economically, that makes a lot of sense and has very little costs in terms of upsetting someone else. So in that sense, GNSS cooperation is very benign. So it's going to move ahead even if the countries are not on the same rhetorical page or on the same ideological page. Even then, countries cooperate on these sorts of things. And then there's, of course, not the military applications, but the civilian applications. But the second thing about high stakes missions about deep space and interplanetary space and cislunar space. So the ILRS project, the International Lunar Research Station project, is something that's been touted as this big moment in Russia-China relationship in the high-tech domain. But I think it has pretty much, stagnated for the earthly matters at the moment. Because, the technical missions might be moving forward. They've been putting out a program of how they're going to integrate Russia's Roscosmos's technical missions, landers and all that stuff, and China's own stuff, their Chang'e missions. But I think the fundamental difference between how the US and the Soviet Union competed in the Cold War and the original space race, this space race, I don't think China is looking to become that principles and alternative soft to law, soft international law and soft to principle treaties kind of progenitor. I don't think that this pragmatic alliance of Russia and China is heading that way because firstly, they might have ILRS as an answer to NASA's Artemis program, but they don't have an alternative as of yet for NASA's Artemis Accords. So I think the US still has some sort of a first mover advantage in that sense because, well, China and Russia have not put out a similar document which talks about guiding principles and soft space law. So I think there's a vacuum there. So the International Lunar Research Station (ILRS) is an area that Russia and China are looking to cooperate on in the high-tech geopolitical domain. But I really don't see it to moving forward. There's a bit of stagnation. So there are 2 points. One is that the agreements on a legally binding agreement is yet to emerge from both sides. The official reason quoted is COVID, but it's not really hard to do a teleconferencing call and sign a legally binding agreement. So the fact that it's being delayed is really not a very good sign. The fact that they only have an MOU and a roadmap from China's space agency is really something of a worry, and should be a worry in their circle.
Right. Fascinating. I mean, on the ideological alternative bit specific to space, I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on that because I don't know sufficient on that. But my sense is that there is a certain ideological worldview that they're trying and which is reflected in the statement, which is in the form of their sort of framing of the notion of democracy, the democratization of international relations, and sort of calling essentially and it's not necessarily a view which is so far offering you a clear sense of how you want the world order to be, but it's essentially a pushback against any sort of unilateral actions and unilateral definitions, which can then become pretexts, which can then become global norms and therefore pretexts for action by states. So, for example, when they say that democracy is a common value for the world and how everybody must sort of everybody has their own form of democracy, Russia and China, world powers with rich cultural and historical heritage that have long-standing traditions of democracy, and therefore, and you should not be states should not be using notions of democracy and human rights to intervene in the internal affairs of other states, and states should not be imposing their own democratic standards on other countries and things like that in order to monopolize, say, levels of compliance with certain democratic set standards and democratic criteria, or to sort of create ideological divisions and create blocs and alliances and all of that. So it's sort of a pushback against what they see is happening, but it's also a framing of the issue in a way which is comfortable to both of their systems. So and which sort of and to me it's a sort of win for the American led system that was set up particularly after the Cold War, which you know democracy became such an aspirational term that while they're redefining it, the language still being used is that it's democracy. But that aside, I want to sort of come to my final sort of thought about India and the implications for India of all of this that we've been talking about. There's a chunk in the joint statement which talks about how Russia and China stand against attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their common adjacent regions. And they talk about being much more willing to intervene to sort of counter interference from so-called outside forces and post-color revolutions. And they talk about coordinated action, that they will increase cooperation in these domains. What does that mean for India, particularly given that, I assume that this will be applicable, or this thought process will also be applicable to the Indian subcontinent and China's approach to the Indian subcontinent, which would be more sort of its periphery than, say, Russia's periphery. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this in terms of India, China, the sort of dynamic between the two of them within this context, because this is calling for a sphere of influence. How would somebody sitting in New Delhi view this?
So it has to be looked at in a wider context because, spheres of influence, I think Russia and China also understand the equation between their interests. So, for example, the last year's meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin, where the Treaty of Friendship was renewed between the two countries, there, China in that to a joint statement paid to a special acknowledgement to Russia's status in the Arctic Circle and along the Northern Sea route. So Russia has invested a lot in its priority for its Far East and Arctic territories to be developed, and it's their priority for the entire 21st century. So I really see that too as a significant thing that China, which declares itself as a near Arctic state, is uh, acknowledging this. So, which is, by the very geography itself is ridiculous because China is nowhere near the Arctic Circle. So, how can it be a near Arctic state? Similarly, on the issue of, the Indian subcontinent, I don't really see India really competing with China or Moscow really being able to, play a very major role in holding back China in the Ladakh situation. I think Russia can play a mediator because it has good relations at the moment with both sides. So it can play a mediator, but I don't think that Moscow has the capability to hold back China as compared to what it could do during the Sino-Soviet split or in the original Cold War. I don't really see that they could exert as much influence on China right now. So from New Delhi's perspective, I think they should really think of managing the conflict with China, not really relying completely on Russia, at least in the Ladakh situation.
Hey, this is what the crucial point is, that from that point of view, if you look at it, to me, this statement sort of has these sort of omens for China's engagement. I would presume that they would eventually sort of see it as their sphere of influence, as their space, as a space where they are the dominant actors. Commonly, when one sort of thinks of this sort of language, it's interesting because there are 3-4 broad areas that one can think of, right? One is Russia's sort of near abroad. One is the Central Asian region, where both have a stake much more directly. Then there is East Asia, and then there is the Indian subcontinent. And I would presume that in this sort of framing, sort of this, the Indian subcontinent would be much more Chinese zone of influence, push comes to shove. And I also take your point about, Russia's sort of leverage over China. I agree. I think it's limited, and I think that from New Delhi's point of view, it's useful to keep this in mind that, there is very limited that Moscow can do. It's partly sort of a function of, the economic engagement between the two sides, where, it is, Moscow is far more dependent on Beijing from an economic point of view. And if there are more sanctions, in case there is action in Ukraine, that dependency is likely to go up much more. So that's going to make it even more difficult for Russia to take strong positions when it comes to Chinese actions with regard to India. Now, that said, from my point of view, I don't think necessarily a relationship between India and China, which is difficult or which has some degree of instability, is necessarily bad for Moscow. To me, if I was to look at it from that point of view, I would see that this friction between India and China, which despite the asymmetry of power between the two sides, is not an easy contest for Beijing, militarily at least, is going to keep, Beijing occupied also in different places. And if the Russians maintain a steady and a good relationship with India, as it has been the case, it allows them to be a crucial actor in the dyad between, New Delhi and Beijing. So that, to me, is one thing that from a Russian interest point of view, some degree of instability might be useful. But of course, escalation into conflict might not necessarily be entirely useful. It creates its own complications. But even then, if there is a small scale conflict which, say, weakens Beijing or hits its reputation and things like that, that might not necessarily be terrible. But it may then also force certain choices, right? The Chinese would demand far more support in such a scenario. It could create far more instability in China, and that may not necessarily be entirely good for Russia. So I think there are sort of benefits and there are pros and cons in this dynamic that if I was to look at from a Russian interest point of view also, and from an Indian interest point of view, I agree with you. I think it's really crucial for India to also get its expectations correct with regard to Moscow, because and I think so far that's been the case, where I don't think there is far greater expectation of Moscow being able to rein in Beijing, and that's why there's been much more effort to look at other alternatives to counterbalance China's rise. All right, so with that, I think we're going to call this conversation to a close. Aditya, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation with multiple sort of facets involved. It's not just about the bilateral relationship between Russia and China, but also its implications for the world order. Multiple trilaterals involved in this. It's the Russia, India, China trilateral, and how that dynamic plays out. It's the Russia, US, China trilateral. It's also the case of Europe as an actor within this bilateral relationship, and their differing interests in Europe having implications for the relationship. And this is definitely a space to watch, and a space that we will come back to in due time. Thank you so much for this conversation, Aditya. And thank you so much for listening.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST. or our website takshashila.org.in.
Do you like true crime stories?
Do you like to learn about the people behind some horrible, awful crimes?
More specifically, women that may have committed these crimes.
Actually, Indian criminals that are women?
Then we'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Misconduct. My name is Raghavi.
And I am Nisha.
We cover themes like murder, dacoity, drug trafficking, financial fraud, kidnapping, and many more.
You can catch us every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcast.
जिस तरीके से हमारे माँ बाप ने अपने करियर की सीढ़ियां चढ़ी थी, वैसे आज के जमाने में तो पॉसिबल है ही नहीं गुरु, क्योंकि हमारा जमाना इतना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है। आज क्या नहीं है, कंपटीशन है, सोशल मीडिया है, इतना इंफॉर्मेशन ओवरलोड है कि करियर का टेंशन ज्यादा होता है, उस पर काम कम। टेंशन लेने से कोई फायदा तो है नहीं। क्या करते हैं, ठंडे दिमाग से सुनते हैं प्रोबेशन से प्रमोशन तक पॉडकास्ट को हर सोमवार, जहाँ पे सिर्फ प्रैक्टिकल बातें होती हैं आपके करियर की। और कौन करता है वो? मैं आपका होस्ट अभिनव त्रिवेदी। ये पॉडकास्ट आप सुन सकते हैं IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट स्ट्रीमिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर।